I never showed my son what was locked inside that workshop safe. When he married Vanessa, I made certain she never learned the combination. The morning my daughter-in-law took a crowbar to the lock while I was 3 states away visiting my brother, I finally understood that everything my late wife Margaret had warned me about had arrived right on schedule. My phone rang at 7:14 inches the morning. I remember the exact time because I was standing on my brother's back porch in Savannah, watching the sun come up over the marsh, holding a cup of coffee I'd barely touched. My son never called before 9 unless something was wrong. "Dad." His voice was tight, controlled in the way he controlled things when he was trying not to panic. "I'm here, son." "What happened?" He exhaled slowly. "Vanessa drove out to the property last night. She told me she was going to her mother's in Decatur. But the neighbor, Mr. Harmon next door, he called me this morning, said he heard banging coming from your workshop around midnight. He went and checked and the lights were on. Dad, she was in there. She had tools." I set my coffee mug down on the railing very carefully. "Did she get it open?" "I don't think so. Mr. Harmon knocked and she left pretty quickly. But Dad," his voice dropped, "she lied to my face about where she was going. She's been back home since 6 this morning acting like nothing happened. I don't know what to do with that." "Listen to me carefully," I said. "Don't say a word to her yet. Call David Marsh at his office and tell him it's time. Tell him exactly those words. He'll know what they mean." "Time for what? What does that mean?" "There are things your mother and I put in place a long time ago, son. Things I should have explained to you sooner. I'm booking a flight home this morning. Don't confront her until I get there." The silence on the line stretched for several seconds. Then he said, quietly, "What's really in that safe, Dad?" "Everything," I thought. Every document Margaret and I had spent her final year assembling. Every piece of proof I had been adding to for nearly 4 years since my son first brought Vanessa home to our farmhouse outside Cartersville, Georgia. I told him I'd call him from the airport and hung up. "Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you're listening from today." My brother found me already pulling up flights on my phone. He'd been married to his wife for 31 years, and he had good instincts about people. He'd met Vanessa once, at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, and afterward he'd pulled me aside in the kitchen and said, "That woman keeps looking at your house the way a developer looks at empty land." I thought about that on the drive to the Savannah airport. I thought about it the entire flight back to Atlanta. Margaret had seen it too, of course. Margaret saw everything. She had a talent for reading people that I'd spent 40 years relying on, and she'd taken one look at Vanessa at that first Sunday dinner and then found me later in the kitchen, where I was washing dishes and said in a low voice, "She's not here for Daniel. She's here for what Daniel comes from." That was 4 years ago, 14 months before the cancer took Margaret, 14 months during which my wife had been very busy making sure our son would be protected long after she was gone. I want to explain how it started because you need to understand that Vanessa was skilled. She wasn't obvious. She didn't walk in asking about property values or bank accounts. She was patient and warm and funny, and she made Daniel laugh in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. She was 34, a real estate agent working out of an office in Marietta, and she knew exactly what things were worth and exactly how to make a man feel like the most important person in a room. The first dinner, she'd complimented Margaret's cooking with genuine enthusiasm. She'd asked thoughtful questions about how long we'd had the property, whether the old barn was original to the 1940s farmhouse, whether we'd thought about what we might do with all this land someday. 22 acres outside Cartersville, the house Margaret and I had bought for almost nothing when we were young and had watched grow in value for 38 years. Vanessa knew that. She knew it the moment she drove up the driveway. She'd reached across the dinner table and put her hand over mine and said, "Mr. Calloway, Daniel talks about this place like it's sacred. I can understand why." I'd smiled and thanked her, and I'd made a mental note. Over the following months, the questions became more direct, always delivered through Daniel, always framed as concern or practicality. Daniel had mentioned that Vanessa thought we should consider getting the property formally appraised so we'd know what we were working with for estate planning purposes. Daniel had mentioned that Vanessa felt couples should have full financial transparency and that maybe it would be healthy for him to understand what he'd eventually inherit. Daniel had mentioned, 6 months into their relationship, that Vanessa thought it was a little unusual that I was so private about the family finances. They'd been dating 8 months when Daniel told me he was going to propose. I took him out to the workshop that afternoon under the pretense of looking at a tractor part I needed help identifying. The workshop was where I went to think. Margaret had always known to find me there when I needed space. It smelled like motor oil and cedar, and something I couldn't name that I associated with every important conversation of my adult life. I told my son I was happy for him. I told him that if Vanessa made him happy, then that was what mattered most. And then I told him I was having some legal documents updated and that David Marsh would be in touch about a few formalities before the wedding. Daniel had nodded, distracted with happiness, the way young men in love are distracted, and hadn't asked many questions. That same week, I had called David Marsh and spent an afternoon in his office on Main Street, making sure everything Margaret and I had structured was absolutely airtight. The farmhouse and the 22 acres were held in a family trust that Margaret and I had established 15 years earlier. Our investment accounts, the savings we'd built across 4 decades of careful living, the life insurance policy, all of it flowed into that trust with Daniel as the sole beneficiary. No spouse had any claim on trust assets. David had explained this clearly to both Daniel and Vanessa before the wedding at a meeting in his office that Vanessa had attended with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She'd signed the prenuptial agreement without reading it carefully. I'd watched her do it. She'd glanced at the first page, looked up at Daniel with an expression that said, "This is just a formality between us," and signed. She thought she had time to work around it. She thought the long game was hers to play. She was wrong. What I hadn't told anyone, not even Daniel, was the safe. Margaret had asked me to build it into the workshop wall during her last summer. Not the kind of safe you buy at a hardware store. A custom job, mounted behind a false panel of pegboard, combination known only to me. Inside it, I'd placed every trust document, every financial record, every legal protection we'd put in place. And I'd added something of my own over the years since Margaret passed. A leather journal, page after page of observations, dated and detailed. 4 years of watching Vanessa work. The flight home landed at Hartsfield at 2 in the afternoon. I drove north on I-75, watching the skyline of Atlanta shrink in my rearview mirror, the familiar rolling green of the Georgia foothills rising ahead of me. My son had texted 3 times. Vanessa was home. She seemed normal. He was finding it very hard to sit across from her at the kitchen table, knowing what Mr. Harmon had told him. I texted back, "Hold on, I'll be there in 40 minutes. Both their cars were in the driveway when I pulled in. Daniel's truck and Vanessa's Audi Q7, the one she'd persuaded my son to co-sign for 11 months after the wedding. $68,000. $1,400 a month. Money that came out of Daniel's paycheck from the engineering firm, while Vanessa's commissions from real estate, which she talked about constantly and deposited rarely, seemed to evaporate before they could contribute to anything as boring as a car payment. I sat in my truck for a moment and thought about Margaret, about the way she'd held my hand in the hospital and made me promise. Promise me you'll show him the truth when he's ready to see it. Don't push too hard too early. Let it unfold. But be ready, Arthur. Have everything ready. I'm ready, I told her silently. Then I got out of the truck. Daniel met me at the door. He looked like he hadn't slept. My son was 37 years old, but that afternoon, he looked much younger. The way children look when something has shaken the ground under them. "She's in the kitchen," he said quietly. Vanessa appeared behind him. She was dressed in what she always wore around the house, expensive athleisure that probably cost more than most people's work clothes. Her expression was careful and soft and utterly composed. I had to give her credit. She was very good. "Arthur," she said, using my first name the way she always did, as if the familiarity was warmth rather than a removal of distance. "We need to clear the air." "I know, Mr. Harmon talked to Daniel, and I know how this must look, but I can explain." "I'd love to hear it," I said. I walked past her into the living room and sat down in the armchair by the fireplace. The armchair Margaret had reupholstered herself in blue fabric 3 winters before she got sick. I always sat there. It was my chair and everyone in that house knew it. Vanessa explained that she'd driven out to the property because she'd been worried about me. She'd heard a strange noise from the workshop the last time she visited, and she was concerned there might be an issue with the wiring. She hadn't wanted to bother me while I was away. She'd just gone to check. "With a crowbar," I said. She blinked. "It wasn't a crowbar. It was a..." "Mr. Harmon described it clearly," I said. "He's 71 years old and he's been farming next door for 40 years. He knows what a crowbar looks like." Daniel was standing near the doorway. His jaw was tight. He was looking at his wife with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of a man who wants very badly to be given a reason to believe something that he's beginning to understand isn't true. I was just worried about the wiring, Vanessa said again. Her voice had taken on a slightly harder edge. You were worried about what's inside the safe, I said. The room went quiet. What safe? She said. But it came out half a second too slow. The one you've been asking Daniel about for 2 years. The one you told him probably contained documents that affected his financial future and that a husband and wife shouldn't have secrets from each other. The one you mentioned to your friend Kira in a text message last April. Her eyes went very still. How do you know about that? Because when you connect to the Wi-Fi at this property, you agree to network monitoring terms in the login screen. It's disclosed right there in the text. Most people don't read disclosures. You've demonstrated that more than once. Daniel made a sound across the room. I looked at him. He was staring at his wife. I pulled the journal from my bag. I'd kept it in my carry-on precisely because I'd understood, driving to the Savannah airport that morning, that today was the day Margaret had prepared me for. I opened it to the first marked page. October 11th, 4 years ago, I said. First dinner. You asked Margaret how long we'd had the property and whether we'd considered the development options for the back acreage. You'd been in the house for 20 minutes. Daniel's head turned toward his wife. I flipped forward. March of 3 years ago. You told Daniel that responsible couples understand their financial picture together and that he should feel comfortable asking me about what he stood to inherit. You'd been dating 7 months. Another page. August 2.5 years ago. You listed this property on a real estate website as a potential comparable sale without our knowledge or permission. The listing was up for 4 days before I found it and had it removed. Vanessa's composure was cracking at the edges. That was a mistake. A system error at my office. It was your login that created the listing, I said. David Marsh has the documentation. I pulled a folder from my bag and set it on the coffee table. David had emailed it to me on the plane and I'd printed it at the airport FedEx. Inside were account statements, records of the car loan, a timeline of financial transactions going back to the month after the wedding. In the 38 months since you married my son, I said, Daniel's personal savings have gone from $42,000 to $11,000. His take-home pay has increased 14% because he's been working overtime. The Audi payment accounts for most of the difference. The Peloton, the furniture you replaced in the house, the trip to Sedona last spring, the membership at the club in Marietta. I contribute to this marriage, Vanessa said. Your real estate income last year was $19,000, I said. I have the tax return. David requested it as part of the prenuptial review. Your half of the household expenses for last year was $31,000. Daniel covered the difference out of his salary. Every month for 3 years. That's not, Daniel's voice broke off. He was doing the math in his head. I could see it. Vanessa turned to him with an expression I'd seen her use before. Soft and wounded, carefully assembled. Honey, your father has been building a case against me since the day we met. He's never given me a real chance. This is what he does. He controls everything. He controls you. I'm not controlled, Daniel said. But his voice was strange and flat. He was still doing the math. I'd also like to show you something else, I said. I opened my phone and pulled up a screenshot. This is a text message you sent to your sister in February. Would you like to read it, or should I? You have no right to my private messages. Your sister's phone is on a family plan registered in her husband's name, I said. Her husband is a client of David Marsh. When he came in last year about an unrelated matter, he mentioned some concerns he had about messages his wife had been receiving. He shared them voluntarily. No laws were broken. I turned the phone so Daniel could see. His face changed. He read it slowly. Then he read it again. Then he sat down on the couch like someone had removed the bones from his legs. I read it aloud for the record. His voice was low and completely steady in the way that voices go steady when all the feeling has drained out. It said, "The old man keeps everything locked up, but Daniel thinks we'll get the farm eventually. I just have to be patient. The property alone is worth over $1 million. I've already talked to 2 developers who are interested. Just need to wait them out." The date was 8 months ago. Vanessa stood up. This is a family matter, and you've turned it into some kind of trial. I won't sit here and be. You're welcome to leave, I said. But before you do, I want you to understand something clearly. The farmhouse, the acreage, the trust accounts, the investments your husband's mother and I spent 40 years building, none of it is accessible to you. Not now, not after 50 years of marriage. The trust is structured precisely to ensure that. David Marsh built it to be unbreakable, and it is. There are no developers to call. There is nothing to wait out. The only thing here that was ever real was my son, and you've spent 3 years spending him instead of appreciating him. The room held its breath. Daniel, Vanessa said. Her voice had changed again. No more softness, no more performance, just cold calculation looking for a foothold. Are you really going to let him do this to us? Daniel looked up from his hands. He had his mother's eyes, Margaret's eyes, clear and steady even when they were full of pain. I'm going to need you to go stay somewhere else tonight, he said. I need to think. I'm your wife. I know. And right now, I'm asking you to give me space. Please. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at me. I've seen that look before. That particular combination of fury and recalculation. A person reassessing the board and finding they've run out of moves. She went upstairs. We listened to the sounds of drawers opening and closing, of hangers scraping in the closet. Daniel sat with his elbows on his knees and stared at the floor. I didn't speak. Some moments require silence. When she came down with a bag over her shoulder, she stopped at the foot of the stairs. You'll regret this, she said, though I wasn't sure which of us she was speaking to. She let herself out. We heard the Audi start. We heard it back out of the driveway, and then we heard nothing. Daniel didn't cry right away. He sat very still for a long time. Then he said, How long have you known? From the first dinner, I said honestly, why didn't you tell me? Because you loved her. And because I knew that me saying it wouldn't be enough. You would have thought I was being overprotective. I had to wait until there was enough truth that you could see it for yourself. He nodded slowly. Mom knew too, didn't she? Your mother knew before I did. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. What's in the safe, Dad? You never actually told me. I want to show you, I said. Come with me. We walked out to the workshop through the cool Georgia evening, the sun going down orange behind the tree line, the way it only does in October in the South. The workshop smelled exactly as it always had. I moved the pegboard panel and worked the combination. Margaret's birthday, April 3rd, 1958. The door swung open. Daniel had expected documents. There were documents, a full file of them, neatly organized in labeled folders along the top shelf. Trust instruments, insurance policies, financial records, the prenuptial agreement with Vanessa's signature. He looked at those. He'd look at them more carefully later. But what made him go quiet was the bottom shelf. Margaret's recipe box, the wooden one her own mother had given her when they were married. A stack of birthday cards Daniel had made her in elementary school. The kind with crayon drawings and misspelled words. Her reading glasses. The small watercolor set she'd used on Sunday afternoons when the light came through the kitchen window at the right angle. A sealed envelope with Daniel's name on it in her handwriting. She wrote it, I said, 3 weeks before she passed. She made me promise to keep it safe until you were ready. His hand was shaking when he picked it up. I left him alone with it. I went back to the house and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, where we'd eaten 10,000 meals together, and looked out at the dark yard and talked to Margaret the way I sometimes did when no one was around to hear. I think I did all right, I told her. I think he's going to be okay. After a while, Daniel came back in. His eyes were red, but he was composed. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and put the letter down carefully between us. She said you'd know when the right time was, he said. She said to trust you even when it was hard. She said real love is patient and stubborn, and it shows up every Sunday, no matter what. She was talking about us, I said, about what we had for 40 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how much is the trust worth? I told him. He sat back in his chair. And none of that is why I came to Sunday dinners, he said. It was almost a question. Not once, I said. You came because it was home. That night we talked until nearly 2 a.m. About Margaret, about the years she'd spent quietly making sure her son would be protected, about the farmhouse and the acreage and the life I'd built here and what it meant to have something worth protecting, about what Daniel wanted his own life to look like going forward. The divorce was uncomplicated. The prenuptial agreement meant there was very little to dispute. Vanessa hired an attorney who reviewed the documents and advised her to accept what was offered. She walked away with her personal belongings, her car loan, and no claim on a single acre of the property she'd spent 3 years trying to access. Her last text to my son was 2 weeks after the papers were filed. He read it, set his phone face down on the counter, and never responded. 6 months passed. Sundays came back. Daniel started coming out to the farmhouse every Sunday, the way he had when he was younger, before Vanessa had gradually redirected those visits toward restaurants she preferred or events on the other side of Atlanta. He started helping me with the property again, the kind of work that doesn't need to be said aloud, just done. Walking the fence line, clearing brush from the back 40, fixing the gate on the old equipment shed. One Sunday in April, he came out with a woman named Caroline. He didn't make a big announcement about it. He just said, "Dad, this is Caroline. She teaches 3rd grade over in Rockmart. We've been getting coffee a few times." Caroline shook my hand and looked me in the eye and said she'd heard a lot about the property and that it was even more beautiful than Daniel had described. She didn't ask what it was worth. She asked what kind of trees were along the north fence line and whether the creek in the back flooded in heavy rain. I liked her immediately. I grilled chicken on the back porch, and Caroline helped me with the side dishes without being asked, moving around the kitchen the way comfortable people do, not performing helpfulness, but just helping. After dinner, she and Daniel walked the property in the last light of the afternoon, and I watched them from the porch and thought about how sometimes things have to break completely before they can be built right. A few weeks later, Daniel came out alone and sat down across from me at the kitchen table the same way he had that October night. "I've been thinking about the trust," he said. "What about it? Mom set it up to protect me." And it did. "But I've been working for 15 years and I've rebuilt my savings and I have what I need." He paused. "I want to do something with part of it, something that means something." "Tell me." He'd been talking to the school where Caroline taught. A lot of the kids there came from families that had fallen apart. Single parents working double shifts, grandparents raising grandchildren, situations where money for things like school trips or sports fees or even supplies was never guaranteed. Daniel thought we could set up a fund, the Margaret Calloway Education Fund, help cover costs for kids who needed it so they could participate fully in things their circumstances would otherwise push them out of. I didn't trust my voice for a moment. "Your mother," I finally said. "Your mother would have loved this so much." He smiled. "The real kind. The kind that reached all the way up." We spent the rest of that afternoon planning it. By the time the sun went down over the back 40, we'd outlined the structure, the amount we'd seed it with, the criteria for how families would apply. Caroline called from the parking lot of a grocery store in Rockmart, and Daniel put her on speaker, and she immediately started talking about which kids she had in mind and how this could change things for them. And I sat at that kitchen table and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of trouble, the presence of something solid and true. That night, after Daniel drove home, I walked out to the workshop. I worked the combination and opened the safe and stood there in the quiet. The documents were all still there, organized and labeled, the legal machinery that Margaret and I had built to protect what we'd spent a lifetime creating. But I found myself looking past the documents at the bottom shelf, the recipe box, the crayon birthday cards, the watercolor set, the reading glasses I'd never had the heart to throw away. She'd been gone 3 years, but she was all through this place. In the slope of the land she'd loved to walk. In the kitchen where her handwriting was still on the spice jars, she'd labeled, "In our son's eyes," when he laughed. Vanessa had come here looking for assets. She'd calculated square footage and acreage and market value and trust accounts. She'd spent 3 years trying to find the combination to a safe, believing that whatever was locked inside it was the prize. She never understood that the real thing worth protecting was never on any of those documents. I closed the safe. I replaced the panel. I turned off the workshop light and walked back across the dark yard to the farmhouse where Margaret and I had spent the best years of our lives. And I went inside, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat in the armchair by the fireplace. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. If there's one thing I hope you carry with you from this story, it's this. The things that matter most cannot be unlocked with tools. They can only be built over time, through showing up, through telling the truth, through loving people more than you love what they represent. Money can be protected by lawyers and documents and trusts, but the kind of wealth that actually sustains a life, that lives in kitchens and Sunday dinners, in letters written by people who loved you before you knew you needed protecting, that kind cannot be stolen. It can only be inherited by people who were paying attention. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this story reached you in some way, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Voices of Uncle Arthur. I'll see you in the next one.